Welcome to the Developer's Diary. I'm Global War 36 enthusiast, and joining me is the lead designer for Global War 36, Morten Monk. Morten has graciously agreed to give us some background about the development of V4. Welcome, Morten, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here.
Looking forward to this series.
I look forward to it too.
Yeah. Well, today we're going to be exploring the concept of import. And in version 3, naval units could only occupy sea zones. But the biggest change in game mechanics for V4 is that naval units, surface ships, and submarines can go in port. Submarines can go in port at submarine bases, and surface naval units can go in port at major naval facilities. If a carrier goes in port, it has to have its carriers denuded of planes, so the planes would have to fly into a different land zone. So, how did that idea about having units go in port develop? What was the origin story?
Well, let's be honest here. In version 3, we had the Italian problem. So Italy was a pain in the ass in version 3. And we looked at many ways to fix Italy. We looked into should we force them into a war? Should we motivate them into the war? And I'm not a big fan of forcing players to do something. So these options, we tried them out, but they didn't work. And I knew for version 4 that we had the option of adding some more stuff in the game. So we took some stuff out that didn't work, and then streamlined something. So we had some room in version 4 for some new things. So when we brainstormed these, what could we add? The import idea came to light. Global War 14 actually have import rules, so they use them to. So they have this. They have the Ottoman fleet, and if they are not in port, they are immediately eliminated from the game. So they need some sort of import rules to make that work. So we sat down at the drawing board and said, well, for World War II, how could import look like? Of course, ships could go in port. That makes sense. That's a simple mechanic. But then what? So whenever when we add something, we should look at, well, how can you counter this? What's the counter ability, so to speak? And in the Second World War, airplanes were huge, and of course Pearl Harbor. Everyone knows Pearl Harbor, right? So we immediately, well, wait a minute, perhaps we can actually solve the Italian problem, and then also perhaps get Pearl Harbor in the game and perhaps a bit more stuff. So that's actually how it started, more or less. And then we actually the way we design is we design by playing. So we actually played a lot of stuff and then tried these different rules out, these different concepts, what didn't work, what was too powerful. And then at the end, we ended up with a list of concepts that is in the rulebook today, and that we will talk about in this session.
Yeah, that was really amazing that you not only solved the Italian problem, but then you created opportunities for scrambling from ports, which is going to create some interesting tactical play where if something just sat in port, then it couldn't project power on the other player's turn without that scrambling ability. Um, and the scrambling ability really creates an interesting dilemma for the attacking player, not knowing what might happen, how many ships might come out. Did you tinker around with the scrambling from port so that you came up with three surface ships or three submarines, or was that based on the airbase rule of thumb with fighters three scrambling?
Whenever we can reuse a component, we do so, because that creates simplicity throughout the game. So 3 units for scrambling, and then if you have radar unlimited, that works very well for air bases. And so we went with this for import as well.
Yeah, I really think that's going to be good for new players coming into the game to see that mechanic. And it seems so obvious now to have something like that for the naval units too, to have an air base for the naval units. So that turned out to be not only solving the Italy problem and to a certain extent also helping Japan, right? Didn't the import rules keep Japan's navy viable longer, or what have you noticed as far as that goes?
Oh yeah, well, I mean there is actually all the major powers more or less are affected by this rule in the import rules. So yeah, Japan is definitely one. But just to touch a bit on the scrambling part, it actually adds a lot of tactical, um, a huge tactical element to the game, because let's say that you want to amphibiously assault something, and the defending player has a destroyer in the sea zone. So now, and if he has some ships in port, he can scramble. If I'm coming into that combat, I'm not sure as the attacker how much naval opposition I will face, and I have to split my forces into a screening force and a continuing force. And I would like to have my heavy hitters shore bombarding, but what if he scrambles? Then I have to I have to maintain a big screening force, big enough that he won't scramble, but then perhaps I don't have enough to take with me for the shore bombardment phase. So it actually adds a lot of tactical elements, and
Yes.
you won't notice them until you've played a lot of games and come up with this situation. And wait a minute, hey, I can do this now. Awesome. And let's. I have some more examples of the tactical issues you can do here, but let's touch
Defer
upon
on
that.
that. I
Yeah.
just want to say that I really like the idea of having a fleet in being, even if you don't have the fleet out to sea, the potential that you could scramble out there does create this interesting tactical threat. So we'll get into that in a little bit. We were talking about you, the cruisers being in port and their ability to contribute militia. If it's a heavy cruiser or larger, each of the ships can contribute a militia. That hit me out of left field when I first read that. Like, where did that idea come from?
It actually came from. So we were trying Pearl Harbor out, and I think we tried 10 or 15 different ones over the course of an evening, and we actually soon realized that wait a minute, if you put a ship in port, you just ignore the fleet and go after the land zone. So that was a big problem, because that turned out to be the best way of dealing with ships in port. Just ignore them and go directly for Hawaii in the case of Pearl Harbor. And that's not historical. And that doesn't work, because then we introduce something that will never be used anyway. So then we looked at, well, let's have larger ships contribute a militia to the combat if the land zone is attacked. Um, in the beginning, we actually had all ships contributed to the militia. And that worked very, very well in Hawaii. It kept Japan from attacking the land zone. But then we went to the Europe side of the map, and then France was totally broken, because now the French player took everything he had and put it into Picardy. So now he suddenly had 10 more units in Picardy. So then we removed the northern option for Germany because that was just, and the French player didn't have anything else to do with his fleet anyway. So back to the drawing board, back to playtesting more stuff, and then we ended up with heavy cruisers and above, contribute a militia. And that's actually also, there's a lot of tweaks in V4 towards motivating players to go after larger naval units. In V3, it was very effective to buy cheap stuff, and so we wanted to mix fleets up a bit, make them more consist of
diverse.
multiple types. Yeah. So that's why we ended up with heavy cruisers and above.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like you can see the evolution now that import was designed to save Italy, and then you needed the port attacks with air units to counter the defensiveness, and then you needed to develop the militia to protect from amphibious assault. But now it's kind of a nice triangle where you have, oh, there was one more evolution, which is the skeleton crew rule that you needed to kind of punish players for just utilizing all the militia. So you needed to have the naval unit essentially, if I'm following how it would work, those capital ships that lose their militia are kind of offline for the next turn, or significantly reduced in their capabilities because they're down to skeleton crews.
They are unable to move, so there's just sitting ducks.
Yep, sitting ducks. So
Yeah.
it's very helpful to hear how this grew. Okay, now let's get into overall strategy. What's been the impact of import on gameplay strategy? Maybe U.S. versus Japan, or how it works with Great Britain, or how the Med plays out.
I would say one overall change is that in version 3, it was a lot about gathering all your naval units in one place, looking at your opponent. How many does he got? I got more than he got. Let's go for it. That was more or less how things went in version 3. In the Pacific, in the Med. To be honest, it has always bothered me, this simple way of doing naval combat. And it's I think it's partly because we have a very simple combat system where one unit has one value for attack and defense. But when we introduced the import stuff, we immediately saw, wait a minute, there's a shift going on here, because you are actually able to and that's actually when we came up with, you can actually go import in the same land zone.
At the end of that combat, you capture Malta, you move into Malta. Yeah.
Yes. So now you have a huge, let's take the Med, for example. You have the whole Royal Navy swinging in Italy, ruling the seas, and you have a cocky Italian player who just take his ships in port, grabs Malta, go in port. Awesome. And now this big fleet is just sitting there. So players, they have to adjust their own way of conducting naval warfare, because we see now that naval units are more split up in smaller task forces. And for example, in the Pacific, let's say that you as I mean, it doesn't matter who you are, but anyone who has a transport in port and a couple of dudes to defend it, the land zone, that's an incredible threat projection. So you don't want your entire fleet standing in one big pile facing the Americans. If you have these transports for example, in Calcutta or in Malaya or in elsewhere. So you have to separate your fleet now to deal with this. So that's perhaps the biggest overall impact from a grand strategy point of view. There's a lot of, if you go down a bit to the tactical level, there's a lot of things going on that is unheard of before. So for example, you have the facility must be undamaged.
Right.
And in version 3, I have never seen anyone do a strategic bombing run on a port.
Well, Spain, it'd be pretty common to try to minimize.
Perhaps Spain, but
other than that, I agree.
It's a huge risk for very little war. But if you have an enemy port that you don't want him to go into, you can bomb it now before he goes in port. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, let's say that he is in port. Of course, you can do the port attack. That's a net positive action. So on paper, it's a good idea to do. And if you have target selection, and there's a lot of good stuff from doing a port attack. But you could also do a strategic bombing attack on the port itself. He has the whole fleet in port. So you do a strategic bombing attack on the port. And he can move ships out immediately, up to 3 ships out. But let's say that perhaps you have ships next to the port, so they will face combat. If he doesn't do it immediately, he has to stay in port. He cannot move out of port. So you're actually able to trap his entire fleet in port.
And the way because of the repair mechanic occurring at the end of the turn.
Yeah,
I forgot about that facilities are repaired at the end of the turn. So even if he does repair that port, he's not free. Interesting.
No. So you can actually trap your opponent's fleets in port. And that creates a lot of cool dilemmas, because it's awesome to go in port because you're safe from enemy attacks. Perhaps, I mean, you have to be careful with aircraft, and also if you damage the port, then what? And that we have seen that in many places where, for example, Germany. It's an awesome strategy now for Germany to have some naval transports in port in Western Germany, ready to go out into either Russia or Great Britain or Norway, because now they are safe from British attacks. But then they must maintain a large force of fighters to deter strategic bombing, because, I mean, that's actually a good way where the Russians and the Allies can perhaps cooperate a bit, because the Russians can also reach with strategic bombing. So it's that brings a lot of good stuff, a lot of tactical issues.
Boy, do I really like that we're not going to do the ginormous, your alpha fleet versus my alpha fleet and see who wins. Because when that happens, the whole game can be determined by a swing of luck one way or the other. But if you have many little attacks where there's little engagements, then regression to the mean, the number of battles will kind of average out. So I really like that. Are there any particular notes that you have about particular nations now? Do you think import has helped Japan, or do you think it's helped, maybe the Commonwealth the most, or do you have any gut feel for how this has affected balance?
Well, one thing is that now you can build ships in port as well. So that immediately helps Japan and Italy if they're being pressed by the Allies, because they can actually build up a fleet if you took out the Italian fleet in version 3, they would never buy a ship again because it would just get launched and then kill immediately. But now they can build up in port until they're ready to attack you. So they're actually able to force the Allies to keep a large force because they will just slowly build up. And the same for Japan. Excuse me. So if the Americans are next to Tokyo, Japan can actually build ships in port. So that helps those nations. The biggest change is, I think, is in the Mediterranean, because due to the range and the sea zones and aircraft, you're actually able to do these port attacks everywhere. And if you're looking at it from an Italian perspective, he's no longer forced to wait until mid-game or late game to enter the game, the war. He can go after Egypt, Malta, Gibraltar. They all have a major port, so he can go after each one of those and go import in that facility.
Mm-hmm. So
now it's extremely difficult for the Allied player to keep a lid on the Italians, because the Italians will just go wherever Britain is weak, and then go import there.
It makes so much more sense because Mediterranean was kind of a dead space in version 3, where you would have maybe one battle the entire game. If Italy got in the war, you'd have one battle, wipe out Italy, and then that was it. So Italy really had one turn they could try to strike something, and then it was over. Whereas now they will be able to do little skirmishes and try to pounce on a target of opportunity, and then still remain in the war, but have the potential to go somewhere else in the future. So
so that has had a huge impact. We also seen Germany going into Norway because they can reach Narvik and go import there, and that's also some of the things that we wanted to get into Norway a bit more, and the import also helps there. We already mentioned that Germany could now build an amphibiously capable fleet in port, and when I'm playing Germany, I usually have 3 or 4 transports sitting in port. It's extremely stressful for the British player because there's a lot of potential dudes that can step on the front door next turn.
Mm-hmm. And a broad front where you could drop those, So.
And the British player, he has a lot of ships, so he can actually go in port and reinforce with militia. So he also has a lot of options.
It's going to be a whole new game.
And the US player, all his ships are bound in port until he reaches 35 IPP. So he's just sitting, biting his nails, waiting for Pearl Harbor, or that's up to the Japanese player.
Right.
So there's a lot of cool dynamic because I had a play test where I was playing Japan, and I said I will go for Pearl Harbor. So I planned for it. I purchased for it. I built extra carriers, extra aircraft. I was going to hit Pearl Harbor hard. But then suddenly, the turn before my attack, the US player got above 35. So he moved his fleet out of Hawaii. And then my fleet was in the middle of the Pacific, a long ass way from anything of value. And it was probably one of the things that cost me the game as the Axis, because I didn't get the fleet, and now I was misplaced because I had to spend 2 turns going the other way around. So the 35 IPP limit that gives a lot of tension in the Pacific because because there are 2 battleships in Hawaii. So we moved the fleet from San Francisco to Hawaii in the setups, so that now we can have a Pearl Harbor attack in the game. Yeah, so that's just some of the things that the major powers are dealing with the import, but also Russia, they can go import in Primorsky Kai. That's interesting. They also have a shipyard on the new map in Primorsky Kai. They have a strategic objective of taking Manchukuo and the Kuril Islands. Manchukuo is easy, but the Kuril Islands is difficult for them. But they can now go import into Primorsky Kai and prepare an amphibious assault. So there are many places on the map where this dynamic is quite interesting.
I was extremely naive because I thought that we could cover everything about import in 10 or 15 minutes. Is there anything else that you want to add about the import mechanic?
I think we have probably played with it for almost 2 years now, and I'm still seeing new things that I thought wasn't possible. And everyone in the playtest group thinks this is the most amazing new feature. So we are totally excited about it. And these in the last game we had a lot of where single transports were sitting in port, which were being hunted down by seaplanes and strategic bombers, and yeah, it really opens up the game to a whole new dimension. So we're very excited about it, and the feedback I've got so far since the rules have been out has been very positive. So I think I think most people they would like this dynamic.
Yeah, and we can only conceive of what it will do to the game. So it's going to be really exciting to start playing version 4. And I look forward to doing more of these developer diaries with you, Morten. So that's the end of our first episode. Thank you so much for joining me, and appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.
Cheers.